Hello, everyone, and welcome to ScreenWorks. I'm John Uriarte, curator of the digital program at the Photographers Gallery in London. ScreenWorks is a fortnightly series of live stream events by Fotomuseum Winter Tour in Switzerland and the Photographers Gallery in London. Together, we launch ScreenWorks to keep exploring the changing role of the photographic image within the network visual culture. Each event is led by an artist, a researcher, or a curator who takes the audience to the spaces where their core practice takes place. The ScreenWorks can be a live performance, a peek behind the scenes of an artwork, or a guided online tour, among many other possible formats. We have hosted more than 50 ScreenWorks so far, so you can find the video recordings of each of them on our website and on our YouTube channel. Please remember that if you have found ScreenWorks useful for your professional or personal interest, do consider subscribing to Folders. And for €7, around £6 per month, you will support the program and its artists, and also get your personal folder on folders.screenworks.com. There you will receive files and extra content from the artists and researchers of ScreenWorks. Some housekeeping information now. Your microphone should be muted to avoid noise disturbances. If that's not the case, please mute them now. And as I just mentioned, we are recording and we will be archiving this event. Please use the public chat to send any comment or question, or alternatively send a private message to Marco, Fotomuseum Winter Tour, or to me.
And hello and welcome from my side too. I'm Marco Demutis, I'm digital curator at Fotomuseum Winter Tour. Today, we are looking at how the internet and online media have shaped the face of information in the past 2 decades. Following artist Anna Ridler in her current work in progress, titled Final Edition, we'll be taken to a tour through time. We'll retrace the rise of social media platforms and the transformation of articles and photographs from printed newspapers to network images and texts, and their social and political impact. Ridler has been attempting to map the final edition of every local newspaper across the US that have closed since 2004, coinciding with the launch of Facebook and the popularity rise of other social media platforms. Today, we are welcome inside the difficulties and ambitions of a project that, in its unfinishedness, reveals the problems of a vanished local collective memory, but also opens up economic questions about value of online images, of archives, and about the role of internet platforms to inform or disinform the audience. Finally, we'll explore the connection between analog and digital forms of images, how the latter might have influenced the disappearance of the former, but also how labeled photographs from printed newspaper might end up becoming datasets to train algorithmic models and machine learning in AI imaging systems, creating different and complex connections between printed and online media and unexpected image ecologies. Anna Ridler is an artist and researcher who works with information and data. She has exhibited at the V&A Museum, Ars Electronica, and the Barbican, and has degrees from the Royal College of Art, Oxford University, and University of Arts, London. Her interests include drawing, machine learning, data collection, storytelling, and technology. Dear Anna, it's great to have you, and thanks for being here with us. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be doing this particular format, because it's always really nice to kind of be sharing something that is a bit more work in progress, and to kind of go behind the scenes and kind of really kind of pick out kind of some of the themes that I've been looking at. This project started 2 years ago when I was on residency in America at a university, and I was very interested in local newspapers. I'm really interested in kind of data and data collection as part of my practice. And I'm very interested because, like, for a lot of people, I think data can kind of sometimes seem like quite cold and sterile and algorithmic. But for me, every piece of data is kind of a trace of a human life. And from that, kind of like, you can kind of see kind of like that kind of being extrapolated out into local newspapers, where they're just kind of like so kind of like micro but macro at the same time. I find kind of like when you start to look at them, you start to see kind of like the same stories occur again and again and again, but you also start to see, you know, like people kind of getting married, schools opening, kind of like very tiny, kind of like beautiful, small little stories. But at the same time, also some really big macro, huge kind of like stories. I've like been doing like a lot of looking at kind of like different ones. There are kind of like some really famous kind of like local, I'm concentrated this project mainly in the US. Despite my very cut glass British accent, I am half American and my partner's American. I spend a lot of time out there. And so kind of like there's this kind of tension with local news, particularly in America, which is very different from how I feel it is at least in the UK, where you've got kind of like a hyper partisan kind of cable TV infrastructure versus a much more kind of local, kind of like more relatively neutral, extremely trusted news source, kind of like in a print media. Whereas like in the UK, certainly you've got like the tabloid journalism kind of like driving kind of a lot of the kind of partisanship, and you've got much more of a neutral kind of scene on kind of like television news. Which so it's almost inverted. So I was really interested in this contrast, and kind of like, and because America is so big, you've got these huge kind of like kind of areas that kind of like the national kind of like papers cover. It's kind of basically like and so you've got this kind of space where you can kind of have these local newspapers that can cover kind of like huge amounts of people, huge amounts of kind of like kind of geographical areas. And so you get these local newspapers who have incredibly kind of like beautiful and important kind of like journalists kind of like working with them. So these are all Pulitzer Prize winning photographs that have come from local newspapers. And of these, so this is from Columbine. This paper is closed down. Miami Herald, they've got their photojournalism department. This was Charlottesville. The guy who took this, who won a Pulitzer for it, is now working for a PR company because they can't afford to employ him. They've got no photojournalists on staff. Dallas Morning News, they've also got no photographers on staff. This is Iowa. Again, this used to be like a really, like, and by kind of like talking historically, I'm just talking like in the past 10, 15 years, these kind of like people who've been winning Pulitzer's prizes, documenting kind of like really important national stories, they've all started to disappear. These kind of jobs no longer kind of are there, and there's no one kind of like working and like looking and documenting in kind of like at this kind of local level. And so I kind of started to kind of like, you know, like start to explore these kind of different stories, because these are all kind of like big national, international kind of events that kind of have been covered, but they're covered by kind of local newspapers, which I thought was really interesting. But the kind of stories and kind of things that I really kind of became drawn to were much more this kind of smaller scale thing. And when I was at Purdue, I got interested in trying to kind of like map all of these local newspapers. One of the reasons why kind of like local newspapers are increasingly important is because, as I mentioned, they're incredibly trusted kind of news sources. But in America, in the last kind of like 10, 15 years, they've started kind of closing at a really, really, really rapid pace. And what I wanted to do for this residency was to find the final edition of each of the newspapers that have closed over the past 15 years, so kind of coinciding roughly with when Facebook started. And this project I envisioned would be kind of like this huge installation of each of the final editions of the newspapers that closed. But when I started to kind of look into it and started to do it, it turned into a very different project, and it became a project about gaps and kind of like the lack and the kind of way that these things aren't being archived, they're not being held, that there's no one looking after these newspapers, there's no one looking after kind of like the history of the newspapers, the archives of them, and how these newspapers and the kind of where they kind of stand and where they kind of sit in the information ecosystem is actually being twisted and changed and shaped by kind of right-wing kind of like editors and kind of private equity. And so it kind of became this other story. And the story became a lot more about kind of like how the internet, although it might promise permanence, actually everything starts to disappear. So I'm going to kind of like talk through kind of like various different aspects of it and kind of how I went about finding things and how difficult it is to actually kind of like find things and on the internet, when even though it seems like it should be axiomatic that these things should exist. So one of the kind of like reasons why I kind of found this kind of like why it's kind of like I think important as well is because when these kind of local newspapers kind of go, so you kind of lose all of these kind of like important stories that aren't really being told. So this is actually the Washington Post kind of went into local newspapers and kind of republished some of these kind of really interesting kind of like hyper local stories, but you kind of lose that ability to kind of like know the area and kind of like to have these kind of like to know kind of like what kind of like the kind of like really kind of like the things that kind of like can expand out and tell you so much more, not just about that local area, but about kind of like the world in general. And so this is kind of like, yeah, so these are kind of some of the stories. Another thing that I kind of found really interesting about kind of like this particular kind of like by looking at these horrible YouTube adverts is that often these kind of local newspapers, that is not what it should be. Often these kind of like hyperlocal newspapers or like local newspapers hold a lot of institutional, a lot of kind of knowledge and history for kind of particular groups. And one of the other things that has happened with a lot of these kind of local newspapers closing is like groups like African-American newspapers, suddenly like all of that history kind of like can no longer be found. It's not kind of accessible, it's not kind of there, and you kind of have a lot of researchers who are really concerned about the way that kind of certain groups who traditionally kind of like might not be represented in kind of like in libraries or books or anywhere else, whose history is kind of found in newspapers and these kind of small little announcements and kind of like these the kind of like local kind of stories. That history kind of isn't being kept, it isn't being archived, it can't be found. If you go to kind of search for these things, they no longer exist. And it's a particular problem for kind of like these kind of smaller rural communities who don't have kind of like that knowledge, that kind of like knowledge of the history of the area stored anywhere else. And so that's kind of, and what happens kind of like when you kind of get the lack of kind of like local news, there's a really strong correlation between not having a local newspaper and then the kind of rise of disinformation and lack of political engagement. Local newspapers kind of really kind of connect kind of people to their area. And so you can kind of see how information kind of spreads on Twitter versus kind of like, and how misinformation kind of rapidly spreads. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later when we can kind of start to see how this has kind of been kind of taken over and kind of changed. And so this is kind of a really interesting report, and where I was in contact with the kind of people who put it together. But this kind of shows the scale of the amount of newspapers that have gone. So nearly 2,000 since 2004. And the majority of kind of them are weekly newspapers only, but 60 of them daily, which leaves kind of some cities, some really large cities like New Orleans, for example, no longer has a daily newspaper. And this report kind of like really highlights the kind of way that this kind of like can impact people, particularly kind of like around kind of like the way that it kind of shapes the kind of like the way that people kind of then connect to their area, because I think, you know, if you have a newspaper and you're kind of you're reading kind of like about what's going on, you can kind of see a connection between what the politics of the kind of area and kind of like your local kind of like lived kind of experience. So, you know, you can kind of see that like your bins aren't being taken out, and you can kind of connect it to the kind of wider picture. Whereas if you don't have that kind of local connection to news, it kind of like all starts to disappear. And this research shows that people who don't have local newspapers are much less likely to be engaged in politics, so they're less likely to vote. Corruption rises dramatically because there's no one kind of like keeping kind of politicians honest, no one's kind of reporting on it. And you've got kind of like also the kind of like rise in kind of like councils and city councils and others kind of like breaking things like environmental laws and things like that. So there's an actual real impact of kind of like all of these things happening. So those are kind of like, so what I wanted to do, so it's like really important, I think, to kind of like record and kind of like support and kind of look after these kind of like these local newspapers. And I thought it would be relatively easy to kind of like go and kind of like find them and to kind of like see where these kind of like papers would be. There is a database that kind of shows what they call these news deserts. So if you kind of go and click and go into, say, Georgia, you can kind of see, it will show you all of the different kind of newspapers that have closed in particular areas, or like where have the newspapers disappeared. So this is the one. And it will show you kind of like the different ones, where they've kind of gone, and kind of like how wealthy their kind of like area is. So you can kind of start to explore and see kind of like where these newspapers have disappeared from. And this is all kind of like very kind of like it's not particularly visually interesting, which is why I kind of really wanted to kind of like find these actual newspapers and go and kind of like, yeah, so you can kind of see how they've all, there's loads in Texas, and you can kind of see also like if you can kind of see how they kind of like the way that they're kind of clumped in the scale of how they've been. So I really tried to kind of like find all of these papers, which turned out to be like way harder than you might think. I built a database where I put in all of the get it up, the newspapers. And so this is what this kind of like map kind of looks like in Excel form. But what I found was, even though so I kind of got this from the University of North Carolina, which put together that report, but even kind of when I went through and tried to find all of these newspapers, I realized that report was actually riddled with error. So even though this was kind of like put out by a very kind of like good academic department, it wasn't actually true. Because I went and I tried to find every single one of these papers, which involved like a very long and kind of like torturous process of building kind of like a data scraper that kind of like went through and tried to find all of these different papers, because I thought it would just be a question of going on to the Library of Congress and finding, kind of going into a database and just typing it in. But this isn't actually what happens. The Library of Congress kind of only will archive papers up to 1963. So they will only kind of, they only have funding to do it. And what I found also interesting about trying to find these is that there is no kind of like central body that is looking after it, rather than kind of like exploring it, rather than kind of like some person kind of looking at this and kind of thinking about it. There's the kind of responsibility for kind of local newspapers is really devolved. Some are being looked after at a state level. So sometimes you've got kind of like the state or kind of like the library service will occasionally kind of like hold them and kind of like look after them. Others are being held by kind of like random historical societies. Others are being kind of held by universities, and it's impossible to know which is which. So it's not a case of being able to kind of just like take this kind of list that I found and kind of like run it through and kind of like get kind of like run it through a single kind of like database and find out where it was. I first of all had to kind of go through and find out whether it had in fact closed, because some of them hadn't closed. I had to then kind of go and find out who might have it, which kind of like institution might hold it, by Googling and by kind of like sometimes even like calling up librarians. And then I had to kind of then go and kind of like work out whether they would then kind of like give it to me. Which was like this huge kind of like weird kind of system of kind of like phoning up kind of like random librarians in Alabama to see whether they would actually in fact kind of like let me have it. Because once I kind of like had found kind of where these final editions or where these editions might be through kind of like like Googling, kind of going through the Library of Congress, going through various different kind of like state library systems, going through different kind of like historical societies. I then kind of had to go and request, so this is also like how, like what it looks like, kind of like trying to search for one. This is all like, it's kind of like weirdly kind of like boring. Well, not weirdly boring, it is incredibly boring, but like weirdly kind of like therapeutic when you're kind of like going through like these weird kind of like public records searches to try and find these kind of like like you end up going through like local paper obituaries to find out kind of exactly where something is, and then kind of like going through those like weird public record searches to find kind of these things. And what happens is that for the most part, to kind of like get hold of them, they're all on microfilm, and you have to kind of like go and request these kind of like really kind of like old school microfilms to kind of like view these kind of newspapers. They're not online, they're not kind of like accessible on the internet, they're this kind of like hidden behind multiple layers. And this is for kind of like for newspapers that kind of like existed within the kind of scope of the internet. I found it so bizarre how kind of like analog the process ended up being, and how for something that kind of like was within the kind of like age of the internet, how kind of like physical and analog it became, trying to find these things. And the other kind of like weird kind of aspect of it that kind of came up was the way that copyright worked with these kind of images and these kind of newspapers. because I was telling people that I was doing it as an art project. And a lot of the times librarians and even and people who kind of like were working with the collections where they kind of like where you could find them would tell me that they wouldn't give me access to them because I didn't have copyright. They didn't have the ability to grant me copyright. So they would say, because I was like requesting them potentially for an art project, they would need to get copyright sign off. And so, and because like nobody owns these anymore, they've gone out of business, they can't kind of like give, there's no one to request them. These are all orphan publications. They don't have kind of like the way to kind of like to give them to me. And there are all these kind of like signs, if you like, when you're kind of searching on the kind of like microfilm about kind of like the copying and the copyright, and it's kind of like, and it's this kind of like weird kind of like way that this is kind of like constantly kind of being shown and kind of like and imposed, even though, you know, these are orphan pieces. There's no one who technically owns them anymore. So they're kind of like doubly hidden. They're kind of hidden kind of like off the internet, and then they're hidden kind of like through this kind of like this copyright. They're kind of totally disappearing from the kind of like information ecosystem. The other thing that kind of happened with them is that the microfilms also, as I'm sure anyone who has kind of like ever done anything with microfilm or archives or anything like that, were never ever correct. So I'd be requesting and working with kind of like these librarians who would send me stuff from all over the country. So I was getting microfilm from Alabama, from Alaska, from California, from Indiana, being sent to Purdue University. And I would say like 60% of the time the microfilm wasn't accurate. So like these kind of things have just been lost. There's no kind of like, they're just kind of like, they can't be found. And from kind of speaking, I would also, from speaking to kind of newspaper editors, because that was the other thing that kind of happened, would be like reaching out to kind of like the former kind of like editors of these newspapers to try and find them. And one of the reasons why these kind of things are so hard to find is because newspapers kind of like were operating at such a kind of like, local newspapers operate with such a small margin of profit. A lot of the time they didn't realize that they were going out of business. A lot of the time they were just kind of like, the way they would close quite rapidly, and they would have no one to take their archives, and it would just disappear a lot of the time. So there was no one kind of like working with kind of like to kind of like archive, because it would just happen so quickly. Another reason why it's so difficult to find these things is because it costs money to archive newspapers. It costs about $1 to scan a single page, and some kind of states, some libraries will have kind of like boxes of newspapers that they just can't afford to scan. They never keep the physical copy. It's always thrown away. It's just too expensive to keep. And so it's kind of like, it's becoming kind of like locked even further kind of like away, even when they do have it, because of it. And sometimes kind of like certain states have money to do it. So there were certain states that actually, you know, you could kind of like find the microfilm, you could kind of like request it. They'd be kind of like quite helpful and send it through because they've like applied for funding and have it. And other states just don't care and don't have any funding, or, you know, don't have any funding and don't have that kind of ability to even do the small amounts of kind of like recording and saving. So I think it was just like, there are all these kind of like different things in play that kind of like made it kind of like harder and harder to actually find the final editions. So of the final editions that I managed to, so there were about 2,000 that closed that I had on my list, and of that I managed to find about 10 actual final editions from the time frame that I wanted. I found a couple more kind of like last known editions, but a lot of them kind of exist only in these very kind of like low quality images. Some of the time I was only finding them through kind of like people posting photographs of them on Instagram, or people posting photographs of the kind of like of the last edition on Facebook or Twitter. So it's kind of like these really, really, really tiny fragments of kind of like of these kind of like of these newspapers, and where they kind of like have ended up. So from like about a year and a half's worth of work, these are the only ones, the only final editions that I could get. And it's kind of like, I find it like quite like incredibly sad and kind of depressing that, you know, like if you think 2,000 newspapers, some of which have been operating for kind of like over 100 years, the only trace of them are these kind of like very low quality kind of images that can only be accessed if you really, really, really kind of like struggle and work hard. So the kind of like the project kind of turned from being the kind of this kind of like desire to kind of like fill each of these squares with a final, with the kind of newspaper, to kind of like this record of it just being these gaps and these kind of these traces, or kind of like of where they were. So as you can see, it's just like empty, like this tiny numbers that I could find. The other thing that I tried to find was the kind of start and end date, and even that is so difficult to find on the internet. It really is kind of like the internet kind of like collapses and kind of like takes out so much of kind of like of what was previously kind of like such an analog kind of vibrant thing. So kind of while I was doing this kind of and kind of really trying to find kind of like these things and watching kind of like them being kind of like decayed and kind of like eaten up and kind of like kind of scattered and being almost impossible to find on the internet, I tried to kind of do other things and try to find traces of them in other ways. And let me just close all of these down, because otherwise I will get too many things open. And then I tried to find them, and instead I kind of like was finding kind of like traces of them on Facebook. I was finding kind of like I would go onto the kind of like different Facebook pages for the old newspapers and try and find them. One of the things that kind of like became kind of like beautiful and kind of like also slightly terrifying is that you can kind of see how on Facebook, on some of the pages, how, because they're no longer being maintained by the kind of like the person who kind of like the editor or whoever, you can kind of see how they're being kind of like taken over by kind of like right-wing bots who would post on the page, or kind of comment on, not post on the page, but who would post in the comments and kind of like look in the comments about kind of like other things, and that kind of started to kind of show something that I will come up. And then you can also start to see the kind of like the mapping. Yeah, so you can kind of see if you go on Facebook, you can kind of see like some of them kind of like kind of like just dead sites, kind of like, and kind of like spam kind of taking over it, and kind of like it's just kind of like, yeah, it's like these are like have started to become the only the only traces of these kind of places. And then the other thing that I kind of started to do is try and find any trace of them. So I can't find the final edition. I can't really find any trace of them on kind of like on the kind of like on the kind of like on Facebook. And then I started to try and see if I could find kind of traces of them on Google Maps, and this kind of like started a whole other kind of like process, which I think I might have closed the tab by accident. But I started to kind of like find them. So if you kind of, I would go onto Google Maps and see if I could like find the newspaper and look through and kind of see how kind of like see how the kind of like area had changed. And some of them, so you can kind of put it down and you can kind of see the newspaper kind of like the trace of it. And then for other ones, so, and you can kind of like see these tiny little towns from Alabama. So this one's in Alabama. And you can see the kind of like how small they are and how these towns are kind of like, and you get a real sense of kind of like the scale of America, really, because you know you get them like in like Alaska. It kind of like shows it shows you can kind of really see like these different things, and this also then becomes like a project around this kind of aspect of it, where I kind of go and find yeah, and like Alaska is just so impossible. Like this is you can't, it doesn't show you can't kind of go on the street view. It shows you the kind of like gaps that kind of exist again in technology in kind of like in these small rural towns, how even kind of like searching for the street that they're on, you can't necessarily see it. You can't kind of like find things that, even though it seems like this one you can, even though it seems kind of like that it's covering everything, it's not. There's not the kind of like there's not the kind of like ability to kind of like have all of this knowledge. It no longer. There's one of them I have on this list, and sometimes like the Google Maps, yeah, won't exist. The other thing that is kind of like quite nice is you can kind of like on some of them you can kind of go through and look through the history and kind of see how the streets have changed. And so the project kind of like evolved from being about trying to capture kind of the kind of like these kind of photographs and find these photographs and these kind of like front pages to kind of like a different way of kind of like recording and a different kind of form of documentary, of trying to kind of like look and find through kind of like these kind of like open big databases to find any trace of these newspapers. And through doing this, that first one that I showed is the only one that I've got of about like, I think I've got about like 500 addresses now. It's the only one which you can actually see the trace of the old newspaper there. And so there's this kind of like, it becomes, yeah, this real kind of detective work of trying to find anything of these kind of like old local newspapers. And so kind of like concurrent to kind of like trying to find all of these kind of like newspapers that had been disappearing, there was this other stream of research that kind of came up, which was like these newspapers that are kind of like popping up, and kind of like you've got these kind of two separate things that are happening kind of like in the news ecosystem. One is you've got something called ghost newspapers, which kind of like are, I couldn't find a good example to show because I've got them, but they're kind of like newspapers that exist that look like newspapers, but all they have is adverts in them. So I've got some like physical copies of them. I don't have it, I can't really show them online. But they're just kind of like, they look like a newspaper, but they're just adverts. And so they kind of show up as being, if you kind of like try and map where there are newspapers, it looks like there are newspapers, but they're not real newspapers. They don't have any real news in them. They're not being run by journalists. But the real thing that I found really interesting was what is called pink slime journalism, which is a very evocative, very nice kind of like thing. It's called like, and yeah, it's like this weird kind of like thing, where you've got these kind of fake local news sites. So if you kind of go in and kind of like click on them, they look like they're local news sites, but they're all kind of run, so they're by a handful of people. So you kind of go into them, that you can't reach because there's a typo, but they all kind of, oh, these have all closed, all the ones that I've chosen, but they're all kind of like run by kind of like a handful of kind of like people, and they all kind of like are pumping out like right-wing kind of like talking points again. So they kind of like, I did save some of them down. So like these are ones that I collected while I was kind of like back in 2020 when it was COVID times. They all look the same. Like if you go, they all have the same kind of typography. They all have the same kind of like headers. They all kind of like are reporting relatively the same thing, but they're kind of like deliberately kind of set up to look like local news sites, but they're not really reporting news. They're kind of like taking and kind of like propagating kind of like, particularly kind of like in swing states, kind of like weird kind of like political right-wing talking points, and the kind of imagery that they use, and the kind of like repeats itself, the kind of layout repeats itself, the kind of like the way that it's kind of working is kind of like again and again and again. You kind of see the kind of the same thing come up, and they're owned by kind of like all people, about 1,000 sites. And I think part of the reason why some of these aren't coming up is that they kind of like they kind of get shut down, and then they kind of like remake themselves. They're kind of constant. They are like kind of like slime or fungus. They're kind of like constantly just kind of like being shut down and kind of like coming back up and popping back up with a different a different kind of like news site, a different kind of like URL, they're not, this is a terrible interface. They're not real. Yeah, so this is kind of like, you can see this one, and it looks kind of like relatively kind of like innocuous, but it's when you kind of like start to kind of like go into the political things, and particularly around kind of like moments of kind of like high kind of like around the elections, that kind of really changes. And they're being run, like, this is one of the people who owns it. Why does that no longer like work? And you can kind of like find, so this is kind of like one of the companies that owns it, and you can kind of see, and you try and trace, and it seems like it's kind of like this very kind of like innocuous, kind of giving the community a voice. But the more that kind of like you dig into it and kind of like see who owns them, it's these like weird, it's these kind of like people who are kind of like kind of very prominent kind of donors to the Republican Party, and who have kind of like, who are basically, for better or worse now, kind of like owning and controlling how these how local news sites are found on the internet. Because if you kind of go and look for them, you're not finding the kind of like sites that the sites of kind of newspapers that used to exist. You're finding these kind of fake local news sites that are just aggregating content and just churning out press releases and these kind of like partisan kind of like talking points. And yeah, there's kind of like a recent report that kind of shows that these kind of like fake local news sites are on pace to outnumber like real local newspapers. And it's kind of like, I think, becoming increasingly more problematic. And yeah, there's like these pink slime outlets is what they're called, which I think is very kind of like very evocative. You can kind of see, like, so yeah, this is one of the owners, and you can kind of see how it looks like there are lots of different kind of like different outlets, that different publishers, different kind of like of these sites, but they all kind of like go up to one single person, which I think again is incredibly dangerous when you kind of think about how news is disseminated and owned, because like it is important, like the kind of like the way that kind of news is kind of like disseminated through these kind of sites does lead to kind of like a rise in misinformation. It does lead to kind of like a rise in kind of like people kind of like not trusting what they see. Let me find. This is one of the dangers of doing it. There are just too many tabs that are open in this way. So yeah, that's where, yeah, that's another kind of like map. So the mapping of it. Yeah. Like, yeah, these like fake local news sites also generate a lot of money, because people kind of like go to them because they want to find something in local, and so the advertising spots are incredibly valuable. But kind of like the misinformation that kind of like comes from kind of like these fake local news sites, you can kind of see it, kind of like the rise of it, kind of, and these kind of stories then travel, and it just becomes this kind of feedback loop, I suppose, for want of a better word. Yeah, so the kind of fake local news kind of that is like propagating misinformation. It kind of spreads more rapidly on the internet. And so you've got this kind of like weird kind of like system of kind of like the thing that has been killing local newspapers kind of is starting to kind of like then kind of like hurt it even more, because the kind of trust that kind of is engendered by local news is disappearing as you kind of have this pink slime journalism. One of the things that kind of like happens or has happened with kind of like this kind of like the decline of kind of local journalism is often chalked up to kind of like Facebook rising and kind of like how news is shared, and that's kind of part of it. But another part of it, another real kind of like part of kind of like the decline is really kind of like through advertisement, because local newspapers used to make all of their money on adverts, and now that kind of like that all happens on Facebook Marketplace. And it was really Craigslist, which is kind of like this very kind of like weird kind of site that is just basically all listings. That is the thing that has killed local newspapers much more than I think more than, yeah, so you can kind of see Craigslist. They have it in the UK, but it never took off. But if you go to like New York, you can kind of see kind of like, so all of these that traditionally would have been like in a local newspaper, they're all online and they're all free, and there's no revenue that is being generated by these kind of like adverts anymore. Yeah, this is also a super janky old website which is impossible to work with. And so that's kind of like been driving it. And then the kind of like final kind of like part of it that I think is kind of like is interesting, I suppose, is that the kind of like newspapers that kind of like do exist that still are kind of like running. I really like this image of all of the old newsstands. Are kind of like being gobbled up by private equity. You can kind of like see that like the number of kind of newspapers that are being owned by private equity is just shooting up and up and up, and that when private equity kind of like buys up a newspaper, it's like it kind of like squeezes it and fires a lot of the staff and loads it up with debt and makes even newspapers that have been profitable into being unprofitable. And this is why kind of like some of those newspapers that are like have won Pulitzers that I showed at the beginning, they're all like having to slash their staff and kind of like are all kind of like in decline. And it mirrors kind of like what's happening in kind of like other kind of businesses which kind of like have seen kind of private equity come in. And so again, you're kind of ending up with kind of like the news ecosystem being kind of like reduced and kind of like shrunk, and so that it's kind of like being owned by a handful of people. And what they're calling like the new media barons are these private equity firms where they own huge amounts of kind of huge numbers of newspapers and huge kind of like ability to kind of shape people's kind of like ideologies. And one of the reasons why this is bad is this is a clip that went viral, I think, a couple of years ago, of what happens when kind of like you have local news owned by a single kind of like, or only a few kind of like entities.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities.
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
Plaguing our country.
Sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
the sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
Unfortunately,
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's.
And so one of the things, so that's kind of like a little insight into kind of like a struggle that I have had and kind of like how I've kind of like pulled together this research and how I think that this thing that started out as an attempt to kind of like find kind of like local newspapers kind of really showed the kind of gaps and lacunas that exist on the internet, particularly when you're thinking about archiving and analog elements, and how there is this kind of like whole thing, this kind of like, I think when people talk about disinformation and misinformation, this and kind of like articles being shared, there's all this other thing that kind of like has allowed that to happen, from kind of like the decline in local newspapers, these fake sites coming up, the way that kind of like Facebook and Twitter like don't kind of like check, but there's there's a hugely analog element to it as well that I think isn't often kind of like discussed or found. And so that is yeah, that's what I'd like to share today.
Thank you so much, Anna. You've been very generous sharing all the work in progress of this project. I was just reading the last comment saying how ironic that they are talking about the degradation of the news, saying that this is dangerous to our democracy while actually doing that. We have a few questions that I want to bring to you. Maybe chronologically reading them. The first one was by Grace, asking, I wonder whether some of these hyper-local stories that used to be in newspapers are now being represented in podcasts?
Sorry, what was that?
The question says, I wonder whether some of these hyper-local stories that used to be in newspapers are now being represented in podcasts?
They might be, but I think the thing with podcasts is that it's also very difficult to kind of then find kind of that information. So if you know that the podcast has happened, you can search for it. But if you don't know that it's happened, it kind of like it's very difficult to index or find.
Thanks also from my side. Let me bring you some other questions also from the chat. We have TOS who asks if you were considering creating a public database for all of the orphan information data or finding a way in which it can be done.
I have been. That's why I was working with the university so that I could kind of like open it all up and make it publicly available. But there are kind of like these issues around copyright. So part of the reason why I haven't done it at the moment is because they are orphaned works. I have to kind of like change them significantly for them to then kind of like for me to then be able to kind of like have to kind of then kind of like open them up.
But I think also connected to this, and just because I remember the text also that you shared when we were talking about this event, you were talking about this idea of creating a data set versus the actual kind of like human stories that connects all of this, and how you were sort of also resisting. Like I'm also interested in this act of creating a data set and how you see this, especially given, you know, like your track record.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of, create something that could be kind of and to also kind of like show the labor that kind of goes into finding these things, because often kind of when you're thinking about kind of finding a particular thing, often people just go to Google and kind of take what is there. And one of the things that came out of this project was what happens when it's not easy to find something on Google, and the kind of labor and the kind of like real difficulty that it then goes to try to find something that to include for a particular thing in a data set, and not just to rely on kind of like the top search results that come up. I think that that kind of like effort that kind of goes into kind of like finding a very particular thing, is very often kind of lost when you're looking through data sets. It's easy to kind of just see how they've all been categorized and how they've all been kind of curated together. And so part of the project, part of this this project has become about the labor of finding things and the labor of kind of creating a data set.
In fact, related to that, Arati asked if you knew the date of the last publication of a given newspaper, if you try making a Craigslist post in the town to see any locals happen to have a copy. So
Yes.
sort of like a crowdsourced
I
process.
did. I did manage to get a couple of physical copies by posting in kind of Facebook groups, and by putting things out on Twitter, and by contacting kind of like the local librarian who put like an analog sign up in the library. And so I did kind of go through kind of like all of these different things to try and find a copy. And yeah, so I got one local editor who had some in his garage. He sent me one, and I did kind of like, but a lot of the time you'd post things in these towns and no one would reply, or they would say that, you know, some of the papers still have an online presence, but they've stopped their print version. They've kind of become these kind of like ghost newspapers. And when you ask about their print archives, they just stop. They stop responding. So there's this kind of like this tension of, again, around kind of like actually trying to find them.
And I think there was also a follow-up question from Arati later on, where they asked, can you speak a bit to the slowness of this process and what it was like to get or request funding for this work, being that it is a slow and careful, caring process?
Yeah, it was incredibly slow, and it was made slower because I did the majority of it during COVID. So libraries would be closed, and because you need to kind of it's a lot of the time with the kind of trying to find the annual editions, it was having to work with kind of the physical microfilm. So librarians would need to be in the library to then kind of ship it to the Purdue library. And because I wasn't always in Purdue, like I was working with some students who would kind of then kind of look through it. And so there were all these kind of like physical constraints around kind of being in a actual location, which stretched the process out even longer than it already was a very long process. But I was working kind of with the university, so there was like a bit more flexibility around that. But I kind of have found the kind of slowness of it to be quite nice. It's something that I do kind of like, it's ongoing, and I kind of like get back into it and kind of find things, and you do become obsessive around things. I think making data sets in the way that I do, you just kind of want to find the thing. I end up spending like hours trying to find one kind of like address, or one kind of comment, or one kind of photograph of something, and all across all of these things, just trying to find a trace of it anywhere, which is quite nice, but it's also kind of very, very, very time consuming.
And TOS was suggesting to use the Internet Archive as a repository, also because says that should be open to preserving these newspapers, and also because different copyright parameters apply, because it's technically more of a library. So I don't know if you have considered that.
I've looked at Internet Archive, but the problem is for a lot of these papers, they haven't got to the point where they've been scanned and then uploaded.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with that is kind of like getting anything that is kind of actually there. So some of them, like I've been on them to try and find various ones. But a lot of the time they'll have kind of the more historic papers, or they might have kind of traces of the historic papers, but they won't have these ones that have closed in the last 10, 15 years. There's a real gap around archiving stuff kind of post-internet, kind of like, because there's this assumption that they'll still be maintained. I've also tried things like the Wayback Machine to try and find kind of traces of stuff. Sometimes kind of like the local newspapers' websites will be there. Other times they're just completely gone.
And maybe just one last thing that was interesting also from the chat. Ronnie Hall was just checking who owns their local newspaper in Chichester. And I'm gonna send you a private message with the link that they shared. So maybe you can also take a look at their interesting business model that maybe was relating to some of the things that you presented.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess that I mean, even if you have focused on the USA, some similarities might be also able to find here in the UK, I guess, with some of the local newspapers. Or do you think that it can be seen in other countries, the similar patterns, economic patterns, and how local newspapers have been closing recently?
There are kind of local newspapers closing, I think, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I found I concentrated on the US because I think it's more pronounced there, and because of the language of it was easier for me to kind of find things in the English language. Mm-hmm. But I think this is kind of a pattern, and I think as well what happens in the US kind of sometimes is a canary in the coal mine for what will happen elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So you can see, I think, at least in the UK, some of the patterns around information and how information is shared and becoming more and more partisan is happening here. You can see the way that kind of GB News has been set up. You can see the way that kind of some of the decline of kind of BBC local journalism is starting to happen. Mm-hmm. And so the dynamics are always different in each country, but I do think that kind of local news is shrinking everywhere.
So I think like we have already like asked you for a lot. You've been sharing
you with questions.
Yeah, you shared a lot of the material of your research. Plus, you replied to many questions from our audience. So yeah, thank you so much for your generosity, Anna. It's been wonderful and very interesting scheme work.
Thank you.
Thank you also from my side. Thank you so much, Anna, and thanks for everybody who joined. This is our actual last Screenwalk event of the season, of the year. So we're going to be back in 2023, sometimes in early February, I think.
That's it, February 1st, with Everett speaking. That will be the first one of the next season. But yeah, that's all. Thank you all also for joining us. Thank you so much, Anna.